Hello, good morning everyone. Thanks for being here. I know that it's been like 4 days for many of you, so now we are heading towards the end of the symposia. We are so happy with what has happened since now, and now we are honored to have with us Olga Goriunova. That we are so happy that she is able to come to ICEA Barcelona. And we are so glad that after the first day with the two talks, that first one with John von Couberta talking about the age of monsters, the second one with Crystal Bauer talking about the thing there is no planet B, this idea of ecology and sustainability in relation to what is happening in how we want to live in the world. And now Olga Goriunova is going to talk about abstract people and model characters. I think it's the great moment to talk about this, but after what we have been talking these days, now this is going to be great. So Olga Goriunova she's professor at the Royal Holloway University of London and author of many books as Art Platforms and Cultural Production on the Internet, or Bleak Joyce, Aesthetics of Ecology and Impossibility, so connected with the possibility, of course, with Matthew Fuller. She's the editor of Funland Software, Pleasure, Pain and Paradox in Computing, and author of noted articles on new media idiocy, memes, and lurkers. She was also co-author of software art platform runme.org, reminded for many of us, and really loved for many of us, before the age of social platform. That was long time ago in 2003. She's a cultural theorist working with technological cultures, media philosophy, and aesthetics. Her research is interdisciplinary and draws upon theories of computing, art, philosophy, and literature in broad terms. She's also interested in the processes of subjectivation in relation to technology and aesthetics, but also in thinking beyond the human in terms of post-human ecologies. Her earlier work in media art is linked to her newest interest in the digital abstractions of the subject through an interest in what happens to the human, gendered and racialized in networked cultures. No? So she's going to talk about many of those things. I think it's many questions that raise. Now that everybody is talking about machine learning and traditional artificial intelligence and data mining, data sets, and everything, we need to get back and to think about what's behind that, what does mean this data analytics and these data sets, and what does mean all the process that it's inside there. So we are so happy to welcome Olga Goriunova. So many thanks. Go ahead, please. They need to put the slides. Okay, now it's ready.
I don't know.
Sorry, there's a technical problem.
Someone need to log in here, re-log in.
What's that? Excuse me? Okay. Okay.
You need to switch to computer now.
Yeah, I get this. We can see it here correctly, so I don't know what's happening there. Just a moment. It was working before, so
Already at 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
It's here early.
Okay. Okay. Let's see.
Yeah.
They don't want us to talk
They're
about
really
that.
awful images, though. We might.
What?
The images are going to be quite bad. So,
Oh, the images.
so maybe we should just not have them.
That's they don't want us to talk about that.
No. I probably fell asleep or something. Okay. Right. Great. Thank you. very
Okay.
much.
Okay, no.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for Pau for inviting me. It's really, and thank you all for coming. It's really exciting to be here, be part of this wonderful event. So this morning I'm going to speak about data analytics and predictive computing. And more specifically, I want to explore how data abstracts people and models us as some kind of future characters. So this topic has been discussed for quite a while, and I'll start by just explaining how I became interested in it and how specifically I approach it. And I also want to apologize for the images because to the audience of artists, because they are pretty dreadful, but that's how these model characters are visualized. So that's how future us or predicted us are visualized. So we have to kind of think about this as well. So it all began quite a few years back, and I always start with this anecdote, but it's really was the beginning of this interest of mine. So I had a PhD student who was working in digital marketing, and she went to a lecture by an American company that was entering British and European markets, digital marketing company. And this company used and combined various sources of data, like census data, data from bank transactions, location data, search query data, different kind of data, to track behavior based on location and kind of link it to neighborhoods and household level. And so my student was sitting in this lecture in the kind of advertisement world, and the woman who was presenting the toolkit, she started zooming in on a specific house in a specific street in London, and describing this person who is living there, or like possible people and their possible behavior. And she was saying, oh, this is most likely a woman who buys organic vegetables, buys books. And my student was telling me this story and said that at some point, looking at this map, she realized that it was me. Like, she recognized me in this description. She knows me quite well, you know, she's been to my house, and we have like a years-long relationship. So she told me this story, and it really shocked me on so many levels. So I was thinking, how is it that my student encountered me in some other form somewhere? What exactly is this digital entity that she identified as me? What relation does it have to me? How do I relate to it? Is it able to stand in for me and act on my behalf without even my awareness? And then attract things, probably the least harmful of which would be advertisement, but then could be more harmful things, and so they do something to me. And then while it relies on my activity, but then it acquires capacity to act on me, how is it produced outside of my awareness? How is it mobilized? It's clearly not I, but then also no one else than I, right? And what are other eyes that are out there that could be, you know, working in medical, judicial, or aesthetic spheres? So I started to think and study this, and the first thing I encountered was this idea of the digital self, and you will all be quite familiar with it. So it usually looks, there are lots of books that have titles such as this, and this is the imagery that presents, so you can see this in the titles of the books that are a variation of the idea that there is a copy of you out there, and it's very personal. So you can also see it in this kind of images that present faceless outlines, but quite concrete, specific individuals. They're not like fuzzy, multiple people. They're quite concrete, although faceless people. So the idea of this my digital subject, at least in like popular imagination, that's what I first found, was presented as some kind of copy of me that's achieved as a collection of all data my existence has ever generated, almost like a collection of all diaries, all conversations, all kind of records that are produced, this kind of box with my name, box in an archive, right, with my name that is stored somewhere in this forever expanding kind of dataverse. And such imaginary figure portrays people as captured by surveillance, which is quite right, in this kind of imaginary of like a Stasi-inspired twist of capitalism, and it foregrounds really individual. So this kind of whole and concrete data subject, and data subject is a term that means like an individual whose personal data is used. And this is the imagery that you would always kind of see in this regard, this kind of idea of a copy, of a kind of a data copy. The term surveillance that is used in this context, of course, comes from Foucault and the idea of panopticon that he developed. And Foucault described this disciplinary mode of power that operates through self-regulation. So you might be surveyed, but you also act as if you're surveyed. And so you have this governmental but also internalized surveillance. And this idea of total self-recording, whether it's fictional or real, which produces us, is behind this kind of images. This kind of thinking is also illustrated really well by an episode of Black Mirror, Be Right Back. I really recommend this short film. So the episode begins with a couple, Martha and Ash, a young couple in love, and they move into a new home. And in the very beginning, Ash is killed in a car accident. And Martha, his partner, turns out to be pregnant, and she's in profound grief. And she buys a computational service to resurrect Ash. And first, this computational service is a software app that, and Ash was a prolific social media user, so the app analyzes all his social media output and chats back to Martha as if it's Ash. And in the beginning, she finds solace because it's able to replicate, Ash's sense of humor and give her some support. By the end of the episode, then she buys a humanoid, and it all goes very unsatisfactory. And although the humanoid outperforms real Ash, it really fails in being her real partner. And this episode takes the cultural imagination of this total data surveillance onto a new level of anxiety about the ontological status of the human. So the history of policing and secret services and the vocabulary of total data capture, they all entertain an illusion of a possibility of existence of this absolute data record per every individual, some kind of replete dossier of personality that is ready to be deployed. And with artificial intelligence, then it would animate this data, producing novel outputs. And so you have a replica of a person. However, isn't there a limit, both in terms of data usefulness for analysis, ecological and financial limit on training such models and the storage and processing of data? and also the limit to the idea of the individual life as a constant self-expression and capturable self-expression. So when I started looking at data that could be collected about me, like at a very banal level, like with data analytics, free data analytics, the pictures I found were very different from this imaginary, and they looked like this. So this is one user. At this first level of analysis, you can see that digital selves are categorical subjects. So they're composed entirely of categories filled with data that's represented either as numbers, and this would be numbers of sessions, or percentages, like correspondence to a given category. So this is markedly different from the idea of a unique copy as an archive of you, right? Data points gathered through my activity, well, this is not mine, but this is just an illustration. Data points gathered through my activity are recorded as values within certain attributes that pertain to people in general. So some data snippets can be entered into fields like birth, date of birth, and certain specific systems, but others are associated with categories that are really loose, like here you have travel buffs, and this is really not like a date of birth. And the use of figurative language in this naming of these categories and a certain kind of banal poetic choice is also something that lays the groundwork for subsequent creation of profile and model idealized persona. I'll talk about it a bit later. So making sense of these data snippets, even at the level of a single user, where possible, is neither existential nor experiential, really. So these basic analytic categories include beauty, food, lifestyle, news, but no art. There's no art. There aren't categories such as, poetic sensibility or political commitment. There's nothing that pertains to your kind of experience as a human that you'd think. So one digital subject is the splicing of categories arranged as bar and column charts. And this is not an individual at all. The framework for expressing this digital subject is determined as a range where a wealth of data points between 0 and a few thousand are sorted into predefined categories within a system of classification whose working principle, like any classificatory system, is to generalize rather than to singularize. So the classical modern subject as a unique and constant individual finds no corresponding entity in these data analytic practices. The numbers in categories might change. They will shift, the order of appearance and importance will shift. So if one clocks more sessions in like sports fan category or health and fitness category, they will move to the top. And so the kind of framework of expression is not constant and is kind of malleable. Likewise, gender will change, may change if the user clocks more sessions as female or male. This is really not fixed. So you can see also that the singularity of human experience is only useful here if it chimes with others. Every feature that describes a person here exists only because it can describe others as well. This means not only that traditional forms of generalization, such as categorization, are at the basis of these data practices, but also that humans are figured in groups that are based on social, economic, and biological regularities. So this kind of generalization, on one hand, is very well studied. So that's what I've discovered quite quickly when embarking on this project, that the beginning of it is the classificatory impulse that is accompanied by the use of the table as a data form, like a very classical table. And it is the logical instrument, wrote Foucault, of the sciences of order, which emerged in the 17th century. So Foucault wrote, the sciences always carry within themselves the project, however remote it may be, of an exhaustive ordering of the world. They are always directed towards the discovery of simple elements and their progressive combination, and at their center they form a table on which knowledge is displayed in a system contemporary with itself. The center of knowledge in the 17th and 18th centuries is the table. So classical thought, Foucault wrote, generated great tables of knowledge developed according to the forms of identity, of difference, and of order. And while tables persist in data analysis and machine learning, as we just saw, they also become somewhat unhinged. And there's a great book by Adrian Mackenzie called Machine Learners, Archaeology of a Data Practice, in which he describes machine learning as expanding the use of the table as a technique of mapping multiplicity. So machine learning, says Adrian, traverses, juxtaposes, and superimposes various tables along different lines than those of the classical tables of the sciences. And we can see what he means. So if we think back to the Google Analytics picture, the categories in that picture are not based on any idea of the norm. So the classical categorical table and the classical system creates norm and normalization, and it creates truth, and this is truth, and this is not truth. But in this kind of use of the table, they are not normative variables, and they are not expressed as truth statements. They are generated like a usual category, but actually the groups can be formed on any basis. And they are often not mutually exclusive. So while these practices use traditional classifications and categories and tables, they really exceed them. So the continuation of the constitution of such tables is not fixed, and the ordering of the world that they offer seem to present a myriad of possible compositions. So on one hand, we have these digital selves that are quite group-based. They are not individual, they are more than an individual. And on the other hand, such groups are very diverse and seem to be, it seems possible to form them on any basis. And because they are also reportedly thousands of categories, the promise is that it's very, very granular and is kind of less than an individual. So Adrian, and this is probably the best picture in all of these slides, this is Adrian's own drawing of vectorization. So he explains that the categories are not normative and malleable, because what happens with tables in machine learning, and this is the basis for prediction, and this is like the foundation of machine learning, which would be the kind of major branch of artificial intelligence. What happens is the tables are vectorized. So that's his beautiful expression of vectorization. So vectorization is a transformation of the elements of the table and relations between them into the system of coordinates, or as Adrian Mackenzie calls it, a vector space. And this is generally how prediction and probability is evaluated in machine learning. The elements of the table that carry the normative power of the category are reformulated as variables and become dimensions, with the whole table plotted into the multidimensional vector space. So Adrian Mackenzie writes that while on one hand things may appear more homogenized, on the other hand, vectorized tables allow for great increase in data dimensionality. So these kinds of abstractions may allow potentially for much greater plurality. So first, what I found is that digital subjects are not exactly us, right? They are more than us because they're group-like. They're also less than us because they are made of these tiny snippets of data, attributes that could really be anything at all. So the idea of the digital self really fell apart by this point. And then I found that there are these predicted selves. And these again have nothing to do with the idea of a double or a mirror, images the data kind of is, despite this kind of images that proliferate. So in fact, probability is what grounds machine learning, both when it's classifying data looking for clusters and interpreting them or generating data by prediction. And this might look like this. So the imagery is like this, as if it's like really, really similar people. And in reality, it looks like this. Some kind of patterns of tiny attributes that are clustered together, depending on the model used. So categorical data points that I started with, for instance, that turn out to be closer to each other in vector spaces, may act as the foundation of new categories and the clusters here. And they're not based on any specific exclusive attribute, but are discovered as neighbors in this pattern of distribution. So the normativity of the category, the claims of the table, the classical claim of kind of exhaustive system of knowledge, are replaced here with patterns of clustering. And it's all about developing models that describe probability distribution of data in these clusters. And these are then used to make predictions about future data. And what's important here is that data doesn't even need to be captured, right? It doesn't have to be your data. It can be inferred from other data. So for example, to illustrate this, two services are currently in the spotlight. One is Facebook lookalike services, and another is predictive audiences that Google launched since the death of the third-party cookie. So lookalike audiences is a service or a set of models that offer like an expansion of customer base. So for instance, you're a company, you sell products online, and you have data on people who actually bought from you. So you put a pixel on a purchase page and you follow these people around other websites, and then you have data on them and you want to find people like them who might like your service. So you go to Facebook, who has a large data set, and ask them to look for profiles with behaviors that might resemble your existing customers. And this lookalike will be targeted with advertising, and this is how they would be visualized. It's interesting, they're all faceless and concrete people. This is quite fascinating, the way this data visualization works. So a group of attributes here is compared and matched according to different degrees of proximity, and a better fit or a higher lookalike yield can be achieved by relaxing or tightening the model. So you would have something like this. In contrast to that, predictive audiences, this is Google, predicts a particular future of like a small pool of customers. So they predict whether you're likely to make a purchase within the next 7 days, or you're likely to disengage in the next 7 days. This is advertised as identifying deep patterns of behavior. Something, yeah, I'm not sure how deep that is. And then again, the imagery would be something like this. So that is why we see that the claim that demographics is dead, which is made by behemoths like Google, but also, statistical community for a long time, because forms of subjection, of making a subject, like assigning sex at birth, the traditional ways in which we think about ourselves through demographic markers, sometimes like your name, your date of birth, your occupation, who you think you are important, but they're not anymore the basis on which the digital subjects are actually made. It seems that identifying and predicting subjects as data patterns rely on completely different practices. They're technological practices, but they're also political, aesthetic, discursive practices. And what is at the basis are historical data and data patterns that are used to construct prediction rules that in turn produce look-alike and act-alike models of users, and they score probable actions of imagined people. So the visual imagery of predicted subjects are often like this. But also all the others you have seen typically contain heads and bust outlines that are at once de-individualized, so it's quite accurate, group-like, and then singularized as locked in specific kind of addressable bodies. So these are uncertain people. And I think it's really interesting that once you come to understand that these are not actually, it's not actually you, but it's kind of a possible uncertain future model of someone. It's not even someone, but it's like a generalized, abstracted character. These are uncertain people like possible tosses of a coin. So uncertain people are produced by behavioral targeting. They're also embedded in context and are always context dependent and built in relation to fraud and other strategies of disturbance. So now we've come quite a long way from the idea of the digital copy. So instead of digital copy, we have this uncertain person, uncertain people models of future people. And another thing that happened to me lately, that I would like to tell you another story, is that I bought a few dresses recently online, and I bought these dresses, and in the next 3 days I had like a flurry of catalogs came through my letterbox, like 7 paper catalogs of shops, mainly with dresses but also other clothes, from companies I've never heard about. And I was thinking, okay, so I was probably modeled as like 7-day top spender from predictive analytics. And then probably like some other people, so these companies are actually modeling my behavior to fit this kind of future uncertain, likely purchaser of these other things. So the shop probably sold my data, and this kind of all became quite inconvenient because they just came through my door and they were trying to convert me into their customer. And I thought, yeah, well, that's kind of, I don't really want this paper and waste that, but here we go. Then at the same time, my bank decided that I was at the risk of fraud. And so the bank sent me a new bank card. So they also modeled behavior of some uncertain threats. So I'm personally affected by this unnecessary paper. I have to deal with my bank. These are still pretty innocent, right? So what affects me is a future uncertain predicted me as part of a pattern look and act alike subject of me. So it comes back to my living self from this predicted group or other pattern subject of alikes, and I don't recognize it as me. In fact, one of the catalogs came from a shop that's founded by a wife of ex-Prime Minister of Britain, the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, who called the vote on Brexit, and I'm horrified to see her face on my table, you know. I'm shocked. I think like, so the subject that triggered this arrival is not me, right? I'm thinking, is my clothes and what I bought resembling conservative clothing? And this thought horrifies me, right? So not that I worry that I'm secretly conservative, but what if I'm recognized as a percentage conservative? I mean, who gave the right to this woman to come, you know, her face to come on my, through my door into my house? And what if I am recognized as percentage conservative in my style, maybe not just by algorithms, but also by people? So this entire event is like a Möbius strip, and I follow the line from me to this abstracted kind of subject, and then back to me, and I always turn out to be on the wrong side. So the process that connects me, my abstract subject, and then me again, is not at all direct, but it's also quite distinct from abstractions that I already described, like categories and tables, and the things I didn't speak about, like classical statistics, because even as machine learning builds on all of them, predictive analytics offers these new kinds of abstractions as real things that trigger action in the world. So by now it's quite clear that not only there's a huge distance between me and my digital subjects in these various forms, in categories, predictions, but also what is at work here is a certain imaginary, what I called like model character in the title of the talk, an ideal, I'm thinking of calling it the ideal in my book. So this ideal classically has two meanings. So it's a mathematical projection, and also ideal as we know it as best, most desirable, best performing, and kind of most useful, some kind of model. And I want to explain what I mean here. So despite all the promotional hype, actually no one sets unlimited number of models on like unlimited volume of data with undefined tasks. It's not possible. It's not like just figuring out endlessly. There are always a priori processes in place that delimit data, define tasks and frameworks, and iteratively decide on the models that will be used. And all of this is points of entry for idealization, for making and using the ideal. So let's look at one of the papers that explains how to predict highly sensitive personal attributes, and then I explain how I think that the ideal is set up in that. So one of the papers that gives an explanation of possibly how Cambridge Analytica, for instance, worked is 2013, quite old paper by 3 researchers. So the kind of stuff that made big scandals with Cambridge Analytica is the kind of inference of things that are not explicitly recorded. So Cambridge Analytica scandal was about obtaining data of tens of millions of voters and then creating their psychographic profiles and micro-targeting them with personalized political ads, right, that potentially contributed to the Trump vote and Brexit vote. So it appeared that it was possible to infer or predict political views from people's online behaviors and understand them enough as characters to produce precisely emotionally targeted and highly successful advertisement that potentially influenced how they voted. So a lot of these highly sensitive attributes are not recorded or recordable. People don't specifically express them, and in many countries it's illegal to collect this data, like ethnicity data. So the whole scandal was about how it's possible to kind of extract this data and then, again, using this vocabulary of like extreme personalization, create this kind of model of who you are to entice you into doing something specific way, voting a specific way. So these 3 researchers, Kaczynski, Stilwell, and Greppel, demonstrate how personality can be predicted from basic digital records. So they selected a number of sensitive traits, such as political views, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, and others. And they also used a taxonomy from psychology, taxonomy of personality, so-called 5-factor or ocean model. So O stands for openness to experience, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. And then they plotted and analyzed volunteers' data, which resulted in correlation given percentage likelihood or binary prediction of these pre-selected sensitive traits, such as political views. So the 3 researchers write, each like attracts users with a different average personality and demographic profile, and thus can be used to predict those attributes, right? So they give this information data sheets where they well, you can see the correlation between likes to different kind of, to one of the factors in the 5-factor model, like openness or conscientiousness. And then they also plot things like this. So for instance, users who liked Mitt Romney, so this is quite old, scored very high on conscientiousness and neuroticism, and they were also the oldest in age. So the scientists don't provide the graph for Republican supporters, but they do provide this graph for Democrats, where the likes of Mitt Romney is almost near zero. So here you see how it's like, voila, you can predict a Republican voter. He likes Mitt Romney, or she scores high on conscientiousness and neuroticism, and then you construct an advertisement that would kind of speak to this kind of neurotic but also conscientious kind of setup of the character. So to come back and rethink this again, it seems that the first step before these data analytic exercises begin is always to set up frameworks and boundaries in relation to which, and tasks and aims in relation to which the whole thing will run. So in marketing, this first step is always to create some kind of ideal persona, or ideal customer, or ideal situation, or set of characteristics that define the problem. So this step of idealization also includes criteria that will be used to determine how useful this whole thing is. So certain results will be rejected if people are just clustered in segments. Some segments would not be usable, inaccessible, or not financially viable. And in this study, the ideal is a selection of traits to be predicted, so they decide on the traits to be predicted. It is the framework, the ocean classification is one of the frameworks. And also this kind of project of an ideal voter, a model character that will respond to your message. So there is a degree of openness here, because machine learning is really omnivorous. It can, make use of all kinds of frameworks and situations and frameworks from different disciplines, and it seems to be quite open. And you can see that machine learning kind of allows for a radical expansion, combination, and multiplication of these frameworks. But it is also clear that it can be quite equally or even more vicious, because although a process does not start from categorization that confirms the norm or enforces the norm, the status quo, it first sets up an ideal voter, right? An ideal subject. For exercises, there's always this kind of process through which a certain kind of ideal model characters, subjects, persons are set up, and there could be a cross-section, not exactly like one entity, but a cross-section between different kind of frameworks and problems and tasks that are defined by those who pay, I guess, for this data exercises. So this ideal subject is granular, and in fact there are a few ideal subjects. So in this paper, that would be corresponding to a combination of percentage scores on 5 factors of personality, and they would reveal also other sensitive traits held in common. And in this precisely, they are model characters, and they would fit anyone who would score above a certain percentage on a combination of personality factors and having other sensitive traits like political views or sexuality, ethnicity in common. So you can see here is not actually that personal, but it is a certain kind of model character, sets of model characters that are set up and that you are kind of responding to as a human. So what we see is that there is a promise of this extreme personalization and personal targeting. But what happens, in fact, is quite abstract, and there are forces of abstraction and idealization that create these model characters. So once data analysis is over, it needs to be presented to the customer. It's also time for description, and we've seen a lot of this already on the screen. And the description often relies on very simple or simpler data visualizations, also narratives and rough character-like sketching. So often to get a handle on these results, these kinds of segments are described as abstracted characters, and they're given a name. So for instance, this is modeling of people by postcode, and from the consumer classification platform Mosaic. And you can see that some of these are familiar and some come from stereotypes, and others can be derived from quasi-sociological types, some kind of handovers of classification, common sense groupings, and a certain kind of banal aestheticization in an attempt to give an expression, an aesthetic expression for this ideal subject of this produced through this data analytics exercise. And you can see stereotypes and biases at work here very plainly, and really questionable choices, like I will show you another one. And it's interesting, there's the performance of this kind of specific kind of poetics and describing the commonality. And the question is, of course, whether it can also escape and will escape the data realm and acquire its own kind of power. And to end, I want to emphasize a few points. So I started with an idea of the digital me, and that was the whole beginning of this interest, and discovered that there is no such thing. Instead, there are various processes of abstraction, and these processes are also not just exercises in mathematical modeling, although I don't think mathematics in itself is like bias-free. There are various steps and stages at which a project of the ideal model character is set up. So ideal profile, ideal sorting principle, judging potential correspondence of attributes to all of this, and then constructing a style, a type of a persona for the group that will determine the message are all steps of abstraction, of idealization. And it is easy to see here that the power exerted by traditional classification, that we know how to resist, and we're kind of trained our whole life to kind of be put into groups and think how to get out of those groups. So this traditional classification is disrupted. The categories and groups are multiple, they are unstable, and it seems to suggest that it is quite an open and plastic process. But what happens is that the idea of the norm and standard produced before is replaced with the ideal, and it can actually come from anywhere and whoever. And just to say, to end, I want to say that I hope that the kind of seeming plasticity of machine learning and omnivorousness can also mean that other kinds of ideals, and not only repressive ones, can be imagined and put into circulation, and that we can all kind of get busy doing that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Olga. It was great to see you, how you've shown us this this promised land of personalization, how it gets abstracted and then gets idealized, and then it is in a completely different way of what's supposed to be. So we still have room for some questions. We've got 5 minutes, so. Okay. Oh, already there's a question over there. I see there's a mic over there. Yeah.
In 1992, George Coates, he's a director of a theatrical group. He did a performance called Invisible Sight. It was quite a remarkable performance for that time, using slide projectors and 3D stereo. But the concept was that the character lost his, or he realized that his digital self, or this abstracted self, had been taken and was used for various purposes. And throughout the entire performance, he's trying to reclaim it, take it out of the system. He wants it back. What can we do to take it back and to form our abstracted selves in the way that we want to be represented.
Yeah, it's always the difficult question of what is to be done. I think what's interesting in what I'm discovering is that it seems like we need to move away from the idea of an individual, that maybe political change is founded on the idea of collective action, and it seems like that what's left for the individual in these systems is only obfuscation, or trying not to be modeled in a way, because of course there will be lots of people who would be deemed uninteresting, would fall outside of the exercise as something that's not worth targeting. But that's just for advertisement. Obviously, there are much more vicious practices, more violent practices that people might not have much choice about. So it's a difficult question. I mean, I think the standard answers are obfuscation and the kind of setting up processes that interfere in the process of abstraction. Another possible thing to think about is to think that we can think of abstract things and abstractions that are not bad. So to speak, abstraction usually has a very bad press. It's something that is allowing for removal of investment, empathy, responsibility. And a question is whether we can think of abstractions, of multiplicities of abstractions that are not necessarily violent, that are not necessarily even human, at least not fully, and whether we can out-abstract some of these things. And I think that's something to be really thought about experimentally and developed. And so if like the balance is between rejection or out-abstracting, I would say, yeah, maybe do both, but also think what are the other ideals, what are the other abstractions, and how we can arrive at them, through which practices and through which political processes. That would be probably the question to be posed.
Okay, there's another question over there.
Thank you. Hi. I wanted to ask you about what we'd call temporal variance, and it might be an answer to this question as well, because the most interesting things to me, I suppose I would be because I'm a moving image, film and animation sort of person, is when you use machine learning through time and you get rid of all the images being 2D, all the marketing images. Also the psychological models are very 2D, 5-factor models. It assumes that we're all static and we don't change. And of course, the interesting things, the really sort of cutting edge things to me in ML and deep learning and even computer vision is this idea of change. And this is where these models don't work. Because on one day, I want to buy Kellogg's cornflakes. Well, actually, I don't. But, on another day, I want to eat muesli or whatever. In the sense that the old psychological static models have been sort of taken out and applied to a kind of rather bastardized model of humanity. And of course, we are subject to inputs at every moment of the day, so we are completely dynamic. And I wonder if you'd sort of start to consider that idea of dynamicism and dimensionality and getting rid of the 2D and going into 4D and ND and all that sort of stuff. I hope that's a question.
Yeah, nice question. I mean, the images, are very 2D, but I hope that image of the multidimensional vector space is kind of one of the answers to your questions, isn't it? That. Yeah. How shall I answer this? So, I think there are lots of exciting things about machine learning, and I think that for people, for artists, and generally, I think people in the art are more, the idea of an abstract model character or subject is not shocking to people in the art world. I would imagine that from what I've seen from the panels and discussions here in artworks, all kind of our work is about creating, intervening into these forms of abstraction. And but it's really a different form of imagining this when it comes to kind of thinking about the kind of sociology inspired, or a certain kind of maybe common imagery. So the kind of dynamicism of this, I don't really, to be honest, I don't really know. On one hand, the kind of idea of liveness and non-static nature of this has been discussed for quite a while. It's like, but on the other hand, I think there's always like driven by a point of intervention, so it's always like a snippet, like a cut in time, and I don't know how dynamic. So the dynamic nature of it is part of it at some level, because as I said, these things can change. They change kind of daily, weekly. What's useful is only what's been around for the last 7 days. On the other hand, I think the point of intervention is always like one moment in time, and it would be interesting to think if there's, more to it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're running out of time. Maybe we can just go to the break, if you're okay. Yes, and then if there's any question, we have time for during the break. Okay, thanks a lot. Sorry.